Now that's unexpected news. China is secretly preparing for Vladimir Putin's departure and for working with Russia without this dwarf dictator. The Wall Street Journal published an article that must have sent chills through the Kremlin. Based on conversations with officials from both countries, diplomats and analysts, it turns out that Beijing has stopped counting specifically on Vladimir Putin. The Chinese are quietly and carefully, without attracting unnecessary attention, establishing connections with the Russian elite and officials who will shape Russia's future after Vladimir Putin leaves. Beijing's logic is quite cynical. Russia's anti-Western course has become so deeply ingrained in society and state institutions that it will outlast the current dictator, Vladimir Putin. That means Putin is just a replaceable figure. If Putin is removed and someone else is put in his place, nothing else will change. What's important is not Putin himself, but the system, which, can continue to be milked. Because Russia has already turned into a full-fledged appendage of China. In this episode, how Russia turned into a junior partner, a partner easily manipulated by Beijing. Why China experts talk about Russia turning into a giant louse. What is the strategy of keeping Russians hanging until they get on their knees? This is not a joke. This is a direct Chinese doctrine. How Xi Jinping forced Putin to capitulate on the UN. And the most explosive part. Why are Russian intelligence agencies now recording the mass recruitment of their officials by the Chinese, but remain silent and do nothing? My name is Alexei Pichi. This will be a super interesting episode, so subscribe to the channel. We're moving toward the 300,000 subscriber mark. I would personally appreciate your subscription. It only takes a second. It would mean a lot to me and be helpful. So let's get to the point. Under Vladimir Putin, who broke ties with the West, Russia has fully turned into a junior partner of China. China, albeit cautiously and not publicly, is manipulating Russia in its own interests. But that's not the main thing. Here's what's important. The Wall Street Journal writes that Beijing is quietly building relationships with the Russian ruling class, gradually bypassing Vladimir Putin and his inner circle. The Chinese are strengthening ties with officials and members of the elite who will determine Russia's future after Vladimir Putin leaves. And this is actually a blow to the Putin regime, one that he is afraid to respond to. Just think about it. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin assures the whole world of his boundless friendship with China. His so-called best friend is already getting acquainted with his successors. By doing so, he shows that the friend here is not Putin. Putin is just a piece that can be easily replaced. Just knock him off the chessboard and put another one in his place. That's it. And China has adopted this strategy. Beijing's calculation is very simple. China assumes that anti-Western sentiments are so deeply rooted in Russia's brutalized society and state institutions that they will outlast the current president. That is, no matter who comes after, Russia will remain hostile to the West, and therefore it is doomed to rely on China. And the bet should be placed not on the individual, but on the system. And here journalists note that when Xi Jinping, just after coming to power, met Vladimir Putin for the first time. In 2013, China accounted for about 10% of Russia's total trade turnover. Well, it couldn't be said that Russia was critically dependent on Beijing at that time. But then, the crazed old man Vladimir Putin decided to attack Ukraine in 2014. And since then, this number has quadrupled. The share of Chinese products in the Russian market today is over 40%, and now the reverse figure. Russia's share in Chinese trade is less than 4%. So that tells you everything about the balance in the relationship between these best friends. For Moscow, China accounts for almost half of all foreign trade. That means it's a matter of survival. And for Beijing, Russia is basically a rounding error. Well, less than 4%, so what? So even if, hypothetically, Russia were to completely collapse tomorrow, China would hardly notice. But if China suddenly stops supplying goods to Russia, well, Russia would simply disappear. If China suddenly closes its market to Russia today, in the current situation, Russia will collapse in just 2 days. But here's what's important. What does Russia supply to China? What does it actually make money on? So, Russia still remains a mere raw material supplier. Russia sells oil and gas to China at huge discounts, plus other natural resources, for example, timber from Siberia. No technology, no capital. No, I don't know, some kind of super cool goods. No, just raw materials. And with a huge discount too, and we'll talk more about these discounts in a moment. The sinologist Alexander Gabuev formulated Beijing's strategic goal quite clearly. He is the director of the Berlin Carnegie Center for the Study of Russia and Eurasia. Next, I'll quote him. China has a truly excellent chance to turn Russia into a kind of giant Laos or a giant Pakistan. A country much more dependent on China, much more closely tied to it. A country that sees China much more as a model and a source of ideas about modernity. Simply put, well, there was a great line about how Russians see China as a model and a source of ideas about modernity. So this wild Russian looks at China and says, that's how we should live, that's how we need to live, that's how it should be, that's what we should strive for once again. In Beijing, Russia is simply seen as China, a giant Laos. Not a superpower, not a second global pole, not Great Russia. No, just a bigger version of a satellite country, which looks up to Beijing and borrows its ideas about how to live. And Gabuev explains exactly how this is achieved. The tactic is simple. Here's another quote from him. It's best to keep marinating the Russians. Wait until the economic situation in Russia gets even worse, until Russians are brought to their knees, so that they agree to terms that are favorable for China. How do you like that kind of friendship, huh? Not to save, not to support, not to pull out of trouble, not to lend a helping hand, but to keep them stewing. That is, to wait until things get even worse. Because the worse things are for Russia, the cheaper it sells itself to China, and Beijing knows how to save money. Beijing, as the Wall Street Journal notes, is cautiously but persistently forcing Moscow to act in its interests. They are building relationships and structures that will last for decades. In other words, the trap is being set not just for Vladimir Putin's term, but for a whole generation ahead. At this point, if Russians had any sense, they would realize that, damn, the issue isn't just that Putin will leave and everything will change. Nothing will change. Because China is taking complete control over Russia. If Putin leaves and someone else comes, nothing will change. You were slaves and you'll remain slaves. China has been extracting resources from you, and it will keep doing so. Maybe it's time to act before it's too late. But let's do this. While this is still abstract, let's get specific. Well, just to make it more convincing. For more than 10 years, Vladimir Putin, fearing the growing influence of China, resisted. He resisted one simple idea: to make the yuan, the Chinese currency, the main currency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's development bank, an institution that is supposed to finance projects in Central Asia. Why did he resist? Because Central Asia is what they call the near abroad, which Vladimir Putin considers to be an area of exclusively Russian interests. He once even let slip the phrase that it's like Russia's backyard. So, Central Asia is the domain of Russians. It's their territory. They control everything there. And Vladimir Putin fiercely guarded this region against any attempts to influence the situation. Putin suggested introducing the ruble there for trade, or even some separate currency, but definitely not the Chinese yuan. And here is the result. Over the past year, Xi Jinping managed to get this concession from Vladimir Putin. Advisors to the Chinese government and diplomats told the Wall Street Journal, financial isolation forced Russia to reconsider its position. Now Moscow is ready to join this bank. In return, it only asks for guarantees that its operations will not fall under Western sanctions. Let me translate from diplomatic language to plain language. Vladimir Putin has handed over his own backyard to the Chinese yuan. Central Asia. He gave Central Asia to Chinese money, the region he protected for 10 years, and said that it was our territory. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. Otherwise, his best friend would just punch that brazen Russian face. Well, now I think comes the most explosive detail of this episode. A source for the Wall Street Journal, close to the Russian intelligence services, reported, "In Russia, cases of Chinese espionage and attempts to recruit mid-level officials are being recorded more and more often." Yes. The so-called best friend is blatantly spying and recruiting Russian officials to work directly for Beijing. And what does Moscow do? Well, maybe they catch the spies, or sue China, expel diplomats, like they do for any other espionage, basically like other countries do. If espionage is detected, they expel, for example, the ambassador or embassy or consulate officials. No, Moscow does nothing. Moscow is in no hurry to bring these issues into the public sphere in order not to worsen strategic relations with Beijing. So Vladimir Putin simply tolerates and observes. There's a word, cuckold. That's Vladimir Putin in this situation. That's the core of Friendship Without Borders in one paragraph. A country that initiates criminal cases for treason just for sending photos on Telegram. That prosecutes Russians just for going out to a protest with a little piece of paper. This country quietly tolerates the recruitment of its own officials. And do you know why? Because it's afraid of offending its partner. And here's the key point. Pay attention. China is recruiting. They're specifically recruiting mid-level officials. Do you know why this is important? Why specifically mid-level? Why not the elite and why not lower? It's exactly the mid-level. Because it's the mid-level officials who, in 5 to 10 years, will become the top-level officials. That is, Beijing is recruiting exactly those who will determine the future of Russia after Vladimir Putin leaves. Beijing basically sees Putin as a sucker, and they're working on his entire inner circle. A little earlier in this episode, I said that China is stringing the Russians along. Let me give you an example of how this happens. Here's how Beijing strings them along in practice. This is most clearly seen with gas. Power of Siberia 2. This is a project that has been discussed for more than 10 years. It should increase Russian gas supplies to China to 100 billion cubic meters per year. For Gazprom, which has lost the European market, this is really a matter of survival. What is China doing? China is stalling for time. In May 2026, Vladimir Putin made his 25th visit to China and his 5th since the start of the full-scale war against Ukraine. He brought with him 5 deputy prime ministers, 8 ministers, the head of Gazprom and the head of Rosneft. It was a huge delegation. Vladimir Putin spoke in Beijing about the limitless prospects for cooperation with China. They signed as many as 40 documents. But not a single one of them mentions either Power of Siberia 2 or even cooperation in the oil and gas sector in general. And then the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, after the talks, mumbled something like, quote, "There are still some details left to agree on. There are no clear deadlines yet. And I repeat, it's been like this for more than 10 years. Do you know what China did at the same time? They demanded that the price of Russian gas be reduced 5-fold. They said, "Why are you selling gas to Russians, these wild creatures, cheaper than to the Chinese?" And Xi Jinping seriously says to Vladimir Putin, "Give China the same price that you have on your domestic market. For the same price that you sell to Russians, you should sell gas to the Chinese at that same price." And if the Kremlin refuses, then China is simply ready to switch to other suppliers. He says, "Listen, then maybe we just don't need your gas. So for the next contracts, please lower your prices." And the point is that Russian gas really has nowhere else to go right now. Europe as a market is lost. There are no alternatives, which means they can put on as much pressure as they want. And here's some fresh news for you. Today, July 14th, there was a report that China has completely stopped negotiations on the Power of Siberia 2 project. Plus, China has reduced its oil imports abroad to its lowest level in the past 10 years. So, just think about it. At the most difficult moment for Russia, when oil refineries are burning, when oil sales revenues are falling, when the country is facing a fuel crisis, when every buyer is needed, a strategic partner, China simply cuts its purchases and freezes the main project. This is what it means to keep someone waiting, basically so that Putin would crawl on his knees to the Chinese leader, and beg him for help. And for now, Xi Jinping is just watching as Putin tries to solve the problem. But here's what's interesting. Why did Beijing start talking about Vladimir Putin's departure right now? The answer lies in Putin's own condition. The state-run VT Siom stopped publishing Vladimir Putin's public trust rating after it dropped to 29.5%. This is the lowest point since the war began. In 4 months, the drop was almost 10 points. This is the biggest drop since Russia's pension reform. Oil refining. Oil refining in Russia has fallen back to its 2005 level. Fuel crisis across the country. The regions are already on the verge of declaring a state of emergency. And in the Altai Krai, by the way, they have announced that a food catastrophe is brewing because due to the lack of gasoline, farmers simply can't harvest their crops from the fields. So, in the 5th year of the full-scale war, Vladimir Putin is facing a combination of challenges that is unprecedented. For all the time he has been in power, and the Chinese are pragmatists, they see exactly the same numbers and exactly the same situation as we do. They are not affected by Russian propaganda. You can tell Russians as much as you want that everything is fine, oil refineries are burning, but it's nothing to worry about. We'll strike back now and the Ukrainians will be overwhelmed. And that's it. Everything will be fine for us. The Chinese see the same things we do. They see these burning oil refineries. They see Russia's problems. And what do? They draw conclusions before anyone else. And the conclusion is this. Vladimir Putin built his foreign policy on one thesis. Russia has a great ally with which it would challenge the entire collective West. He traveled to Beijing 25 times. He sold oil to China at a discount just to keep this ally. He even handed Central Asia over to Chinese influence, and Putin keeps silent about the Chinese recruiting his officials. And he was the one shouting about how he and China would build a multipolar world together. And at the end of 2021, let me remind you, Putin even challenged NATO. He said, "You should wind down your activities because did you see what kind of ally I have? Be afraid. Now, together with China, we'll really show the whole West what's what." But in reality, after 5 years of full-scale war, Putin ended up with less than a quarter of China's trade. So, not such a critical partner after all. The stalled power of Siberia 2 pipeline. So, Putin was boasting, but now China is saying, yeah, let's probably stop dragging this out. That's it, we won't do it for now. Plus, Putin got that Xi Jinping is demanding he slash the gas price 5-fold. And Chinese diplomats who are already getting acquainted with those who will come after him. That's what Vladimir Putin got. The most humiliating part of this story isn't even that Beijing is preparing for a Russia without Putin. That makes sense. Diplomats are preparing, politicians are pragmatic, and no, Putin will eventually leave. No. The most humiliating thing is that China is doing this because it doesn't care at all who sits in the Kremlin. For some reason, Putin imagined that he is important as a figure, as a person, as an actor. No. The only thing that matters is that Russia remains isolated, angry at the entire West, and, crucially for China, cheap. Just cheap, that's all. Putin entered this war to restore Russia's status as a great power. But instead, he got the status of a big, offended, and very obedient gas station, which is already having its next manager picked out. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.